Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Lauren Stewart, Operations Director at BookNet. Welcome to Diversity in Canadian Book Publishing, findings from the 2022 Baseline Survey. And before we get started, BookNet would like to acknowledge, that our physical office is upon the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and Wendat Indigenous peoples, the original nations of the land we now call Toronto. BookNet's operations are currently remote, and our staff contributes their work from these traditional territories, as well as those of the Mi'kmaq people from the lands we now call Beaton, Brampton, Guelph, Halifax, and Vaughan. We encourage you to visit the native-land.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you are joining from today. Moreover, BookNet endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and support an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. The book industry has long been an industry of gatekeeping. Anyone who works at any stage of the book supply chain carries a responsibility to serve readers by publishing, promoting, and supplying works that represent the wide extent of human experiences and identities and all of their complicated intersectionality. We at BookNet are committed to working with our partners in the industry as we move towards a framework that supports space making, which ensures that marginalized creators and professionals all have the opportunity to contribute, work, and lead. For our webinar today, if you're having any difficulties with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please put your questions in the chat, or you can always email us at techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We are providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, please find the show subtitle button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. If during the presentation you have any questions for us or for our wonderful panelists, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu, and we'll loop back to those at the end. Lastly, we'd like to remind attendees of the code of conduct. Please do be kind, be inclusive, be respectful of others, including of their privacy, be aware of your words and of your actions, and please report any violations to techforum@booknetcanada.ca. And do not harass speakers, hosts, or attendees and/or record these sessions. We have a zero tolerance policy. You can find the entire code of conduct at techforum.booknetcanada.ca/code-of-conduct. Now let me introduce our speakers today. Luciana Iregue is a Canadian-Argentinian writer and publisher from Amisquashi, Sikaikan. Her imprint, Labyrinto Press, which is the BPAA's 2022 Emerging Publisher of the Year, produces hyphenated Canadian literature and global literature in translation. Luciana loves walking everywhere, especially the Edmonton River Valley. Jazz Cook is a mixed indigiqueer Kanekawa Mohawk with British and French ancestry from Aguesasne, Quebec, the Mohawk Nation, and Cornwall, Ontario. They currently work as the Membership Services Manager at the Association of Canadian Publishers, the national voice of Canada's independent English language book publishers. They're also a member of and volunteer to the Indigenous Editors Association, which seeks to support Indigenous writers, editors, and publishing professionals, and ensure the respectful representation of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian publishing industry. And Danny McDonald is the Research and Communications Manager at the Association of Canadian Publishers, the national voice of Canada's independent English language book publishing industry. Originally from Prince Edward Island, Danny has a Master's of Art in English from Queen's University and has worked in communications and content development for various organizations across the arts and culture sector. So I'd like to hand it over to Danny, Luciana, and Jazz to get us started today.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Does that look good to everyone? Yes? Okay, perfect. So thank you again for joining us for the results of the 2022 Canadian Book Publishing Diversity Baseline Survey. So I'm going to just hand it over to Luciana now for a little introduction.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny. And thank you, Lauren. Thank you everyone for joining us today for the presentation of the 2022 Canadian Book Publishing Diversity Baseline Survey results. Danny McDonald and Jazz Cook will be leading you through a summary of the report's findings. But before that, I'm going to give you a brief background on the process behind creating the survey and report. A reminder that the full report is available on ACP's website at publishers.ca/resources. In 2018, the Diversity and Inclusion Working Group decided to administer a baseline survey to gather information on the composition of Canadian publishing workplaces, with the intention to identify challenges and opportunities with respect to building diverse and inclusive workplaces. The results showed an industry with an undeniable diversity problem. 82% of respondents identified as white, 72% were straight, 74% were women, 80% were non-disabled. When heads of firms were asked if they had plans for any new initiatives to support diversity, equity, and inclusion, close to half answered no. And many shared that although they already had DEI policies in place, it was still challenging to move the dial in practice. The working group recommended the survey be repeated again in 3 to 5 years, which brings us to today. The 2022 survey was developed by the Diversity Baseline Survey Advisory Group, which includes myself, Amanda Crocker from Between the Lines, Shisa Sarfraz from ROM Press, and ACP staff, Jazz Cook, Kate Edwards, and Danny McDonald. The advisory group also received feedback on the survey design from the Diversity and Inclusion Committees as a whole, which is co-chaired by Amanda Crocker, Annie Gibson from Playwrights Canada Press, and Shisa Sarfraz. ACP would like to recognize the Access Copyright Foundation for providing funding to hire an independent consultant to support the survey design and report preparation. Thank you, Karina Palmitesta, for your excellent work in analyzing the survey data and writing the report. Thank you also to Danny McDonald, Jessica Riches, and Trish Osage for their work on typesetting and editing the report. For the purposes of accurate comparison, the 2022 baseline survey questions and response options, for the most part, matched those of the first baseline survey in 2018. Several new questions were added to collect information around salary, compensation packages, education, and work arrangements. When it came to creating new questions or adding additional response options for existing questions, we tried to consider a wide range of experiences that can affect results from or introduce barriers to creating a more diverse and inclusive workplace. We have received feedback from some respondents that changes could be made to our questions to better represent all of the different aspects of our industry. And we welcome any further feedback on the survey design so we can present an even more robust round of questions when the survey is repeated in another 3 to 5 years. With that background information out of the way now, I'm going to pass it along to Danny and Jess to present a summary of the survey results.
Thank you, Luciana, for that introduction. So now I'm just going to move into a general summary of the survey results and our methodology. So the online survey was open between July 5th, 2022 and September 16th, 2022. And we received a total of 439 responses. In comparison, the 2018 survey was open for a similar period over the summer and received a total of 372 responses, which marks an increase of 67 responses between the two surveys. The link was distributed to book publishing firms across Canada. This was done by direct email, through other publishing associations, and also via social media. The Association of Canadian Publishers also partnered with the Canadian Publishers Council to assist with the survey distribution to their membership, which is made up of multinational firms. The survey was open to staff at book publishing firms of all sizes, all genres, all geographical locations within Canada, and also to both Canadian-owned presses and multinational firms that operate within Canada. ACP asked that the survey be shared with full-time, part-time, and contract staff, as well as with all interns and freelancers that were working at publishing houses. The survey was conducted in English and distributed primarily via English language publishing associations and through English language publishing book media. So though some representatives of French language publishing firms may be represented in the results, the report is understood to reflect the workforce of the Canadian English language publishing industry. So the survey was anonymous and self-reported. Participation was voluntary and all questions were optional. Heads of firm or equivalent were asked to answer an additional set of questions about their companies, in addition to the survey questions that captured demographic information that we asked everyone to fill out. So of those 439 responses, 87 identified themselves as heads of firm. Of the responses gathered from heads of firm, all were completed by representatives of Canadian-owned publishing firms. So we didn't receive any responses submitted by heads of firms of multinational publishing firms. Staff employed by multinational firms are represented among the general survey results. However, they only make up around 14% of total respondents. So while we were happy to see an increase in the responses compared to 2018, it is important to note that the sample size of the survey is still rather small when compared to the size of the industry as a whole. So it's difficult to find an exact number of the people employed in the English language publishing sector, but I did find in a 2020 Statistics Canada report that they reported approximately 8,800 jobs in book publishing in Canada, which would also include jobs at French publishers and may include jobs that are publishing adjacent, like printers and sales reps. So of those nearly 9,000 jobs, around 2,300 were located in Quebec. And while not all publishers in Quebec are French, of course, and there are plenty of French publishers operating outside of Quebec, for the purposes of getting a rough estimate, if we subtract that number from the total, we get approximately 6,500 jobs in the English language publishing industry in Canada, which would put our survey at only around 7% of the total industry. Again, this number is just a rough estimate. So for example, I also found a 2023 market report conducted by IBIS World, where they reported approximately 5,200 jobs in publishing in Canada. And if we again account for French publishers, that would put us at perhaps around 3,850 jobs in the English Canadian publishing sector, which would have our sample size sitting at around 12% of the total industry. So in either case, with whichever number, we are looking at a relatively low sample size. Getting voluntary responses, of course, for a survey that had nearly 60 questions can be difficult. And in the future, if funding permits, we may look into the possibility of paid solutions, either to increase the reach of the survey or to perhaps offer incentives to participants in order to increase our sample size. So now I'm going to move into some of the data. So for the purposes of comparison, for most of the slides, we're going to show you a graph from the 2018 version of the survey against the 2022 version of the survey. So you can see visually how the industry has or hasn't changed in the past 4 years. Also note that in questions that are asking demographic information, things like race, gender, and sexuality, we've selected our response options to match those used by the Canadian Census, just in order to allow for more direct comparison with the population as a whole. So first, we're going to look at race. So this is the 2018 chart, and it shows an industry that is largely homogeneous in terms of race. As you can see, around 82% of respondents identified as white. For reference, in the 2021 Canadian Census, the number of Canadians who identified as white sat at 69%. So it is above the population as a whole. East Asian was the second largest group, sitting at around 5.7%, and all other response choices received less than 4% of responses. Next, we have the 2022 chart. It shows a very similar makeup in terms of race, with some slight upticks in diversity. So the industry as a whole has remained majority white, but we can see that the balance has seen a statistically significant shift since 2018, down from 82% white to around 75% white. East Asian remains the second most represented race reported in the publishing industry. It's increased by around 2% since 2018 to around 7.8% in 2022. The largest jump in representation was in South Asian respondents, which grew from 1.8% in 2018 to around 5.7% in 2022. A few other categories saw around 2 to 3 percentage points of increase, including Latin American, biracial, and multiracial. So if we look at that race data on a more departmental level, we found that almost all individual departments saw anywhere between 7% to 20% more respondents identifying as BIPOC, except for executives and interns, who we actually saw the percentage of BIPOC identifying respondents fall by 2% and 5% respectively. By a narrow margin, we found that publicity was the least racially diverse department in 2022 at 79% white identifying. And by contrast, the least racially diverse department in 2018 was sales at 94% white identifying.
So like race, the gender charts in 2018 on the left and the 2022 on the right remain fairly similar. The publishing industry is overwhelmingly made up of women, with the percentage increasing slightly in 2022 compared to 2018. The greatest difference from the previous survey is the amount of respondents who identified as cisgender, where 14% fewer respondents overall, including 10% fewer heads of firm, identified as cisgender in 2022 compared to 2018. However, just because only 36% of respondents selected cisgender, that doesn't mean that the other 64% is gender diverse. More likely, as respondents were asked to select all options that applied, a portion of respondents selected just male or female without also selecting cisgender. There were some upticks in gender diversity across the board in the publishing industry. Respondents identifying as gender diverse, including transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and two-spirit, increased from 5% in 2018 to 10% in 2022. Despite the increase in gender diversity since our last survey, the ratio between male and female staff remained near identical, both industry-wide and for heads of firm. And despite making up only 16% of total respondents, men represent 35% of those in executive roles. Next slide, please. Diversity in sexual orientation. There we go. Diversity in sexual orientation has seen some diversification since our last survey in 2018. 11% fewer respondents overall identified as heterosexual, and almost every other category saw an at least 1 to 3 percentage point of increase. The largest increases were in categories of bisexual, which increased by around 4.5 to 17%, and queer, which increased by around 6% to 13.7%. Although 11% fewer respondents overall identified as heterosexual compared to 2018, the percentage of heads of firm identifying as heterosexual saw an 11% rise to 82% compared to 71% in 2018. In comparison to the overall respondents, 61% of all respondents identified as heterosexual, which is a 21% point difference. Statistics Canada reported in the 2018 census that only 4% of the general population identifies as LGBTQ2S+, in comparison to the 30% of respondents to our industry survey. So moving along, we have a pie chart detailing the percentage of survey respondents with a disability. For this question's response, a disability includes, but is not limited to, physical, sensory, cognitive, intellectual, or developmental disabilities, chronic conditions, and mental illnesses. Respondents with a disability rose 9% overall, from 17% in 2018 to 26% in 2022. It's likely important to consider that this survey covers the time period of the pandemic, where many people in Canada were affected not just by complications directly related to COVID-19, but by increased wait times for healthcare overall. Also, as stigma decreases around less visible disabilities, such as a chronic illness, neurodiversities, and mental health issues, this may contribute to higher rates of self-reporting.
Okay, moving on to employment status. So employment status across the publishing industry has stayed fairly similar to 2018, with a few notable differences. So the percentage of respondents working as freelancers or contractors, as opposed to salary staff, grew by 7%. And in 2022, non-salaried staff made up approximately 23% of all respondents, so close to a quarter. The majority of respondents working in publishing are employed full-time, although that category did see a decrease of around 2 percentage points since 2018. Next, moving on to departments. So we have these two charts showing the different spreads of departments in 2018 versus 2022. Editorial remains the department with the largest percentage of respondents, but it has dropped from around 42% in 2018 to 38% in 2022. The largest increase was in marketing and publicity, which grew from 30% in 2018 to a combined 40% in 2022, as we did split the categories up. The category with the largest drop was executive, which fell from 22% in 2018 down to 17% in 2022. It's important to note here that respondents were able to select as many departments that applied to their role, as many publishing professionals do wear multiple hats, especially at smaller presses. So we found that on average, respondents work across 1.5 different departments based on our answer choices. So looking at that departmental and employment status data and cross-referencing it with our other survey metrics, we found that interns still represent the most diverse department in our survey, which is the same as it was in 2018. So in 2022, we found that 33% of interns identified as BIPOC, 78% were on the LGBTQIA+ spectrum, and 56% identified as disabled, which is all a very significant departure from the industry as a whole. On average, we found that firms employed 1 paid intern and 1 to 2 unpaid interns annually, where an unpaid intern is one receiving either an honorarium or an educational credit. On the flip side to that, we found that heads of firm represented the least diverse category in terms of race, gender, sexuality, and disability. And across almost every survey category, heads of firm experienced no statistically significant change since 2018. Moving on to salary. Early in 2022, we did learn that Quill & Quire would not be repeating its 2018 salary survey of the publishing workplace. And because of this, the Diversity Baseline Survey Advisory Group decided to include some new questions regarding remuneration in the 2022 version of the survey. Because we needed our response options to more or less match the options in 2018, our data is not quite as granular as the Quill & Quire report because we looked at departments rather than specifically job titles. However, we are looking into the possibility of conducting perhaps a more robust salary survey in the future. So as we can see from this chart, full-time salary respondents earned in the range of $40,000 to $60,000 per year on average. And we've also found that executive level staff earn in the range of $60,000 to $70,000 per year on average. A look back to that Quill & Quire 2018 salary survey suggests that wages might be stagnating a bit in the publishing industry. So in 2018, that survey found that the average annual salary at Canadian-owned firms was around $48,000 per year, and at multinationals, it was around $56,000 per year, both of which fall into that $40,000 to $60,000 range that we found in our survey. We also found that when it comes to non-salaried workers, half of all freelance and contract respondents earn less than $30K per year on average from their earnings related to publishing work. We also found that 63% of firms offer cost of living adjustments annually or on an ad hoc basis when budget permits.
Another new category in this year's survey is in education. A 93% majority of respondents hold some sort of post-secondary degree. 42% of respondents hold a bachelor's degree as their highest level of education. 34% hold a master's degree. 5% of respondents hold a high school diploma, and only 4% hold a doctorate. While the vast majority of respondents have post-secondary education, only 59% of respondents have completed schooling that specifically pertained to publishing, whether that be a publishing program or courses related to publishing. Of all departments' executive level staff, for example, CEOs, COOs, CFOs, publishers, presidents, and vice presidents, are least likely to have completed schooling related to publishing at only 39%. Moving along to this next pie chart, another new question asked in our most recent survey was about current work environments. Half of all respondents reported working both remotely and in person in some sort of hybrid model. 40% of all respondents work entirely remotely, and just 9% of respondents work entirely in person. Some interesting points to share regarding work arrangements were that when heads of firm were asked if they plan to keep hybrid or remote arrangements indefinitely, 81% said yes. Almost all heads of firm commented positively on the increased flexibility, work-life balance, job satisfaction, and productivity that these arrangements bring to employees, especially those with disabilities. This is quite the departure from Canadian industries in general. According to a report by Canadian HR Reporter in July of 2022, which is right around the time that this survey was live, around 3 in 4 workers in Canada have returned to pre-pandemic work arrangements, with only 17% of people working from home or in a hybrid work model. Considering the fact that nearly 1/3 of Canadians say that they would look for another job if their employer forced them to work exclusively from the office, the Canadian publishing sector is definitely ahead of the curve when it comes to accessible work models. We also added a few questions around career development and job satisfaction to the survey for 2022. The first chart shows the percentage of respondents that have been promoted or changed positions at their current firm. Around 57% of respondents answered yes, and this number may be attributable to the fact that more than a quarter of survey respondents had been working in publishing for over 15 years, leaving lots of room for growth at their respective firms. The next chart shows Then the next chart asks whether respondents see themselves working in the Canadian, my apologies. I've lost myself in my notes here. The chart on the right asks whether respondents see themselves working in the Canadian publishing industry in the next 5 years. The majority of respondents, 72%, answered yes, and only 5% answered a definite no. Similarly, 86% of respondents reported that they're not currently working or not currently looking for new career opportunities. And this is a huge departure from the Canadian population as a whole. In a 2021 study from Ipsos, 45% of respondents indicated that they were likely to look for a new job in the next year. This discrepancy may also have to do with the fact that, as mentioned earlier, the Canadian publishing sector has largely embraced remote and hybrid work. And many Canadians have expressed wanting to leave their job if they were forced to go back to the office. So for those who answered no to the question of whether they see themselves continuing to work in publishing in the next 5 years, the #1 write-in response was because of low wages. Almost no one mentioned actually disliking the work that they do, just that they weren't being fairly compensated for doing it. Here are 2 different examples of survey respondents sharing their perspective on this decision. The first reads that I've always wanted to work in trade publishing, but the reality of low pay and high workload make the possibility of rent/home ownership almost impossible for a young professional. And the stress of taking on the responsibility of multiple departments negatively impacts my mental health. This was from a Canadian press, or Canadian presses can be very small. The second response reads, yes, I enjoy working in publishing and I'm at a point in my life where I can survive on a low salary. However, if I'd like to start a family in a few years, I would consider leaving publishing for a higher paying career path.
Next, we're going to take a look at the diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. So here we have 2 charts, both from the 2022 version of the survey. The first pie chart shows the percentage of DEI policies in place at publishing firms. So we had 63% of respondents say their firm currently had DEI policies and initiatives in place, which rose by 14% since our last survey. About 19% reported they were unsure about the policies, and 14% reported that no policies were in place at their firm. The second pie chart shows heads of firms' responses on plans to implement new DEI policies and initiatives, which sits at around 52% answering yes. This percentage rose by 17% since 2018, which actually makes it the single largest swing in responses between the 2 surveys. For those that have DEI policies currently in place, we did ask for them to send in write-in responses. And from those responses, we found that 32% of respondents mentioned actively trying to recruit or hire diverse staff. 25% of respondents mentioned that their firm has an internal diversity, equity, and inclusion committee. 19% of respondents mentioned publishing diverse authors and attending DEI trainings and workshops. And other initiatives that were included in the comments were internal written policies covering DEI, discrimination, harassment, and/or human rights, monthly reading clubs or forums, either for BIPOC staff or company-wide, government funding for diverse interns or staff, and also prioritizing accessible offices and event spaces. So similar to the 2018 survey, many respondents noted that while their firms have diversity and inclusion initiatives in theory, their objectives have not necessarily been achieved in practice. So in those open-ended write-in responses that were submitted by respondents whose firms had DEI policies, some mentioned that they didn't know what their DEI committees actually did, and others pointed out that the committees relied on unpaid time from staff with no reduction in workloads. So the common thread again was that even with the best intentions, DEI efforts are mostly scuttled by low funding, overwork, and understaffing. And because of this, DEI initiatives are often spearheaded by the very people that are meant to be benefiting from them. So again, we've pulled some quotes from the survey that illustrate some of the shortfallings with some firms' DEI policies. The first comment comes from a rights staff member, which reads, I'm exhausted. All the D&I work I see comes from the junior levels of publishing houses. No real commitment at the executive level. So nothing really changes at all except for lip service. And then we have a second comment submitted by a production staff person, which reads, we have a policy statement, but little actions or accountability attached to it. Initiatives are taken up by staff independently. And next we have plans to implement DEI policies. Jazz, did you want to take this one away?
Yeah, absolutely. I was responding to the Q&A, but I didn't quite finish typing that out, so I'll just pick up where I'm supposed to. We're at DEI policies and chart, or no, where are we? Hold on, I've got so many windows open. DEI policies and academia. Perfect, okay, so for heads of firm that have plans to implement DEI policies, 31% mentioned writing or updating a policy covering DEI, discrimination, harassment, and/or human rights. 22% mentioned scheduling trainings, events, mentorships, or fellowships. And 15% mentioned implementing recruitment strategies for hiring diverse staff and freelance contract workers. Other responses included soliciting submissions from diverse authors, forming DEI committees, and making offices, websites, and their products more accessible. There we go. Again, we've pulled some write-in responses from the survey from heads of firm, this time sharing their future DEI policy implementations. The first reads, "We are working on something we are calling indigenizing our process. This includes adjusting our approach and our process to include more collaboration and more conversation." The second reads, "I don't really know what an official diversity policy looks like compared to simply keeping it front of mind and always questioning our practices." While the upswing in firms implementing DEI policies is promising, there are still the questions of what those policies look like and what they will achieve when put to practice. For those who answered no, we're asked to identify what resources or supports would be needed for them to implement initiatives to better support diversity and inclusion in their workplace. Nearly 70% mentioned a lack of funding as the main barrier to both recruiting and hiring more diverse staff and implementing DEI initiatives. Other responses include a need for discussion and collaboration with peers to develop best practices before implementing and needing access to training and education. Written responses from heads of firm with no DEI policies in place or current plans to implement them include, "We are a small company with so much to do and no one formally trained in HR or DEI. We've got creating policy and keeping up with the daily work takes time, and we currently don't make a living wage." And the third is, "Specific goals for diversity and inclusion are tough to pursue with a small staff and budget."
Thank you, Jess, and thank you, Danny, for the presentation of all the numbers and these quotes, the quantitative and the qualitative analysis results from the survey. Now I will be offering some takeaways. The numbers overall paint a picture of some positive changes towards a more diverse industry since the first diversity baseline survey in 2018. In particular, the questions around disability, race, and gender identity saw statistically significant changes in most departments. And in fact, some populations are overrepresented in the publishing industry, like the LGBTQ plus community. However, the numbers still show a mostly homogeneous industry in terms of race, with 75% of respondents identifying as white. According to Statistics Canada's 2021 census, 27% of the general population are visible minorities, which at first glance appears to be more or less in line with our survey results. But when we consider the fact that the vast majority of publishing firms are located in large cities and analyze city-level census data, we can clearly see that most publishing firms do not reflect the communities around them. For instance, Toronto and Vancouver, with 56 and 55% respectively of the general population being visible minorities. On a more positive note, the new questions around work arrangements show an industry that has embraced hybrid and remote work, a departure from many other Canadian industries. Inflation in Canada has risen a total of 14.69% since 2018, and housing costs across the country have soared, especially in largest cities. At the time of this writing, Toronto and Vancouver logged year-over increases of 24% and 17% for a one-bedroom rental, respectively. Given the findings will be considered by ACP's Diversity and Inclusion Committee. So I think that this is, yes, the correct slide, which will be asked to recommend future areas of activity for the association in pursuit of our primary goal of increasing diversity in the Canadian publishing industry. The survey committee recommends that this be repeated in 3 to 5 years' time, as we said earlier. And now, part of our qualitative analysis, one last takeaway: commitments get stalled or fall on the shoulders of the few marginalized workers who advocate for them. This is from a design staff member. And now off to the content of, to a bit of a takeaway about the content of this last slide. This is more of a personal takeaway. The last slides consist of this anonymous testimony of someone working in the design area of a publishing firm. It refers to a sentiment shared by many BIPOC, LGBTQ2S+, and disabled people. Quoting and paraphrasing BIPOC author Jenna Butler, who wrote an enlightening reflection on the report at the Read Alberta blog. As a BIPOC head of firm, I feel this anonymous testimony is an example of the reservations most of us in those categories have when expressing ourselves in public. Jenna says, more or less, I'm paraphrasing her, I am aware of my responsibilities to my BIPOC community, and in doing so, I may stand in harm's way by being outspoken. Yes, as we have seen in this survey, the task of engaging in necessary diversity work falls more often than not on those who are from underrepresented backgrounds, usually at the lower levels of an organization and on their own time and initiative most of the time. A personal takeaway is to think of the idea of nature versus nurture, wishing for more training for non-BIPOC, LGBTQS+, or disabled heads of firms. Future informal mentoring could take place amongst publishing professionals at the upper level if they wanted. For underrepresented publishing industry professionals, our daily grind is embedded in diverse hiring practices, from being head of firm to hiring designers, copy editors, authors, web developers, etc. But there are structural reasons why the dial does not move, and we do not see diversity in the upper ranks of the industry. And here it is, where this takeaway might shed some light on this matter. Despite being recognized by our peers at the provincial level and finding a larger community of support and friendships, publishers like us are still unable to benefit from EDI grant money because in the eyes of federal granting agencies, we are not large enough in an arbitrary Goldilocks game of publishing. There are no surveys for arbitrary government red tape to address and access funding for EDI or for BIPOC emerging publishers. Diversity work while BIPOC sometimes feels like one must pay dues and wait patiently as other underserved groups move slowly down the line as they're invited to the table in the hopes one day our turn might come. As we watch those larger firms access grants that would mean for us the difference between staying in business or not. Can you imagine an emerging BIPOC press being able to produce 8 books a year instead of 1? That is the critical difference between access to EDI government funding initiatives and being kept out of the granting system. When will it be our turn? When will it be our turn, we ask ourselves. My question is it wrong as a BIPOC publisher to want to thrive in an industry that at every step is hostile to our principles unless there is granting money. Again, the issue is structural, deeply rooted in government funding schemes for publishers. While larger firms and not-for-profit organizations can access EDI grants, publishing houses like ours may not survive past next year due to lack of access for funding specifically designed for us. So here's to wishing that armed with all this new data provided in the baseline survey, we collectively take stock of the situation and ask ourselves what can be done individually, be it joining forces for lobbying on BIPOC, LGBTQ2S+ disabled behalf in a show of true allyship, so that the dial move faster and more intentionally. Thank you for listening in to all the presentation, these thoughts on this topic. Now we would like to invite the audience to share individual takeaways or questions and engage with the report. We would like to thank now everybody at BookNet and our audience for attending. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luciana. And just while we give everyone an opportunity to drop some more questions in the Q&A, I just want to acknowledge straight off the bat the work and commitment that this survey represents. In case people are not aware, the ACP is a mighty staff team of 4 people, and initiatives like this represent a really significant commitment of their resources, particularly staff time, as well as volunteer time, often coming from individuals like Luciana, who are running their own firms and initiatives. Luciana's press started within the past 2.5 years. And so I just want to thank you all for putting the work in on this study, and it is so valuable. And just to get things kicked off, it's a little methodology question for you. Of course, it's BookNet. We love data and studies and things like that. So let's start from the beginning. Why is it so important to revisit surveys like this every 3 to 5 years, as the committee has suggested, and as you did with this from 2018?
I can take a stab at that one. Again, just because it's a baseline survey, we want to see how the industry has changed. And the whole point of it is to increase diversity in the survey. So the first 2018 was really the benchmark that we were working with. And the 2022 is how have things changed. Again, like Luciana was mentioning, things have stayed mostly homogenous. There's been some slight upticks in certain metrics, but it's important to continue doing these surveys so we can see the progress of diversity across the industry.
And I think we should acknowledge that your response count of 439, I did some quick math as you were presenting. That's a 20% increase in responses year over year. 67 is it's a big number of responses from 2018 over the 317 who replied that year. Have you been able to identify any factors as to what drove that increase? Any guesses you have, or any educated guesses you may have?
Jazz, I'm not sure, were you around for the 2018 survey? Maybe
I was around for the 2018 survey. Yeah, I joined ACP staff just as we were launching the survey, so got to see some parts of that play out. I'd wager that the increase is just in the distribution for the survey itself. Back in 2018, we didn't have as much of a concerted distribution of the survey on like social media or like through like press and media, or outside of, seeing it shared through association newsletters and email blasts. We didn't have that level of distribution. Also this year we did partner with CPC, so we've also have the increase of staff who are employed by multinational firms. Though it is a small margin of the responses, it still makes up a portion of the increase.
Yeah, and I think if that partnership continues, you'll likely see an increase, as you already saw an increase in this year, year over year. I say year over year, but we mean 2018 to 2022.
Yeah.
I just keep thinking about this, and I've spent a lot of time with the 2018 and the 2022 edition. I'm wondering about, like one of the best times when I finish a project is that moment where you can like start to think of the next one and like kind of what you've learned. And so if you do revisit this again in 3 to 5 years, as the committee recommends, like what would you like to see? Are there new methodologies you'd like to explore, something you'd like to revisit or redo? How are you feeling about it?
I personally, like I mentioned in the presentation, it would be nice to have more robust salary information so we can look at that based more on race, on gender, on sexuality, and look at where those gaps are for pay compared to those different metrics. It is difficult. We were having this discussion before, kind of looking at those cross-referencing metrics because our sample size is so small. So for example, we were looking at percentage of people who had seen promotions or changed positions at their firms, trying to look at it on a race level. But because, if there's only 4 South Asian respondents and coincidentally all of them have been promoted, that doesn't mean that 100% of South Asian respondents are getting promotions all the time. So, I mean, the biggest thing that I would like to see is just an increase in sample size. But again, that's pretty difficult with a voluntary survey.
And I think you've offered some interesting ways that you could possibly incentivize additional responses. But I think also here we can mobilize, as Luciana mentioned at the end in her takeaways, part of allyship is participation. And if we can participate through providing our own data, whether or not, we are necessarily, part of a dominant group or not, or an equity seeking community, like we should all be participating in things like this so we can, gradually increase that sample size so we can get really valuable responses out of this. The next thing I'd like to, Luciana, I was really moved by your conclusion. I think it, like you are both like a member of the steering committee and also a principal of your own firm. If for those who don't know, Luciana started a company right around the pandemic, I guess, and essentially sole operated. And you are the ship that's, you don't just steer it, you are the ship there. And so you've had this behind the scenes perspective, building this survey and working with the committee and working with the folks at ACP. And I'm wondering, with this perspective, anything that lingers in your mind as you kind of thoughtfully and intentionally build up your own company? What have you taken from the survey? How are you influencing the choices that you make as you build and expand Labyrinto's process and company?
Or in my case, first of all, I was super grateful that so early, soon as I joined the ACP, and I'm such a rookie in every single way. It's not like I know the organization that well. And I was very, very thankful for the committee to allowing me to work on this. It's been really a privilege. So I want to talk about this from a point of privilege. I'm privileged to be a head of firm and a BIPOC head of firm, and therefore say things that may not be said in an anonymous way. So perhaps it's my responsibility to help move the dial a little bit further. And as per how it impacts the results impact my firm, it's even to become more intentional about our hiring practices, because I do hire freelance people. It's all I can afford right now. But in every step of the way, I've been thinking very hard how intentional I have been to incorporate as many diverse practices as I've been able to. So, I've hired disabled and LGBTQ plus and BIPOC. My logo was designed by someone who identifies as Indigenous and is neurodivergent. And it just happened naturally. So if it would be a piece of advice for firms who are more traditionally based, if you feel that it doesn't happen naturally, just again, try to be more intentional. It's not about the money sometimes, it's about the intention, because I really have a very small budget. So it's like at the moment of making your decision, this is an unsolicited advice for non-BIPOC or whatever, traditional head of firm. Who are your hiring choices? And if you start thinking about that, then everything changes, because yes, of course, you will get grants to publish diverse authors, and that's great. That has opened up a big door for diversity in publishing in Canada. But it has to be something completely intentional. If you haven't been embedded in it, soaked in it, as I say. I don't know if I make sense. Thank you.
I know, I think that that all made sense. I think that was fabulous. And I think that also what I hear you saying is that part of your allyship is speaking with dollars, that by actively paying people, and particularly, intentionally paying those out in a thoughtful and intentional way, that you're helping to, make a more equitable environment, particularly for freelancers who have a less stable work environment. So I think that that's really valuable contribution that anyone who has influence on hiring or sourcing can absolutely take something from. And I'll ask kind of a similar question to Jazz and Danny. What were you drawn to in the kind of conclusion and takeaway section? There's a number of, just for the audience, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to the study on about page, I think it's like 30 and 31. There's a great roundup of respondents' kind of suggestions on how the resources and support that would be needed for them to have implement initiatives that would support diversity and inclusion in their workplace. And I'm wondering if there's anything that stuck out to you, Jazz or Danny. Is there anything that you can see as something really interesting that could be implemented, or something that you'd like to see more firms pick up?
I mean, somewhat like we saw in this survey, and a little bit pessimistically, a lot of it does depend on funding. So it is difficult in that sense when, small BIPOC firms aren't receiving funding. Canada Book Fund hasn't been increased in 20 years. Inflation is up. So, I mean, it would be great at the core of it to just see more BIPOC and more diverse staff hired, and not just as interns, which, I mean, it's a good program, hiring diverse interns, but they might only stay for 6 months and then that's it. And I believe that's why we had so many, or we had the interns being the most diverse department in the survey, because there's that program. But again, a lot of that depends on funding. So I don't know, Jazz, maybe if you had any ideas that don't depend on funding, because that is kind of a difficult point.
Yeah, honestly, it sort of is the same takeaway as you, Danny. Like, it's hiring and recruitment is incredibly important in publishing to get people into the door. The next step with a lot of this work is going to be about retention and keeping people in the industry, keeping people wanting to be in the industry, because and like people say, there's a lot of it is contingent on funding. At some point, it may need to be a reprioritization of how funding, or how just where you spend your budgets. And that's maybe a hard answer to hear, and it's a difficult decision to be making. But if we're not going to be seeing increases to funding, which obviously we hope for, we really want to get ourselves funded so that we can keep these without too much strain. But that sort of is the takeaway that I get still from the 2022 survey results.
And I think what hearing what you're saying, Jazz, like a reprioritization of resources, like particularly budget, I think not relying just on funding actually speaks to a larger part of the industry as well. As we know, the multinationals are not receiving funding for these programs, and that would not be, so to have budgets kind of shift in a direction that was a little more intentional, I think speaks to kind of like outside of just the funded categories of firms that receive money. You also mentioned, you were talking a bit about attrition, and that was something that came up kind of in the middle of the presentation about people leaving the industry, and how this is quite different when contrasted to the wider Canadian population of people looking for jobs or looking for other work in the immediate future. Why do you think there is less attrition? If we know that it's not a diverse industry, if we know that we struggle with wages, low wages, living wage amounts, why do you think there's less attrition when compared to the Canadian population?
I think. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Luciana. You probably have a better idea.
No, well, I worked in the visual arts field, before becoming a publisher, and I remember the low wage. It's from personal experience. Again, I was a gallery attendant, and it was just, the pay was this small. The job was completely temporary, but it was the lure of the arts job. It's that mystique. We have to acknowledge the mystique of the business. And that's the main attraction of the publishing business, is the allure of the book, is the cover. And then we go from the other side and we see their realities. But we keep in what Lauren Berlant deemed cruel optimism, in the sense that we will remain there because maybe things will change, because maybe, you know, our pay will improve. It's just something intrinsic to the fashion industry, to the visual arts galleries, and to the book industry as well. It's the product we sell.
I think you've definitely hit on something there. What's that adage that we've heard so many times? If you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. Well, it's still work, everyone. Let's make sure we treat each other well and pay each other fairly and up to living wage standards. I think that's the end of our time, and I'm sorry, because I think we could have gone so much longer, and I want to again reiterate my acknowledgement and appreciation of both the ACP, the CPC, and particularly the folks that we have here today, Luciana, Jazz, Danny. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we do close this off today, we'd love it if you as the audience could provide feedback on the session. We will drop a link to the survey in the chat. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. It is quite quick and easy. We do read the responses and really do look at those in terms of how we structure our programming and offer events. We'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of the session as soon as it's available. We will have captions edited, all of that kind of stuff. So if you need to have a transcript, that's a way to wait for it as well. Lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage and of course the Access Copyright Foundation for their support of this study in particular. And thank you, all of you, for attending. We are so grateful, and I hope that you all can use this study to go back to your firms where you have influence or where you have the ability to implement change. You can at least have a document now that you can rely on and maybe at least start a conversation. So thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day and stay safe out there.
Thanks, everyone.